The following interview is a presentation of Ofiɔ Media. My guest today is Dr. Ebenezer Obadare, professor of sociology at the University of Kansas and author of a remarkable book called Pentecostal Republic, in which he analyzes religion as a political force in Nigeria while paying particular attention to the power of the country's theocratic elite. In addition to this groundbreaking monograph, he's written and edited several other books, as well as publishing quite a few essays. Dr. Obadare is the editor of the Nigeria-based journal Democracy and Development, and I think he sits on the editorial boards of at least 4 or 5 other journals as well. I don't believe it would be an exaggeration to say that Dr. Obadare is one of the sharpest minds analyzing Nigerian politics today. So naturally, it's a tremendous honor to have him on the show. And on that note, Dr. Obadare, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, my friend. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I'll start with a fairly straightforward question.
Okay.
Would you explain, for the benefit of a U.S. audience that's mostly unfamiliar with Nigerian politics, the role that identity markers such as home region, such as ethnicity and faith play in Nigerian politics? Specifically, in what ways do these markers align or perhaps not align as political forces? And also, if I failed to mention any significant categories, such as class, for example, please feel free to talk about those as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question to start. I think you might want to start by just basically acknowledging that, to study Nigerian politics or to study African politics is to study politics, everywhere. So all the markers that you mentioned, whether you're talking about, ethnicity, you're talking about class, you're talking about, a sense of regional consciousness, you're talking about all those identitarian markers apply equally, to how people make sense of politics in other parts of the world. I think, the central question, in an African context is, the intensity and the passion with which people still, aggregate around those identitarian markers, right? And I think that's because, for the most part, the distinction that exists elsewhere between what belongs to what you might call the civic space and what belongs to the primordial space, those lines are still rather blurry, and people find it very difficult to make those transitions. But once you extrapolate from an African context, the truth is that identitarian markers shape how people the struggle for political resources, the struggle for public goods, those markers shape the way people, aggregate around those things everywhere.
Thank you so much. That's a really insightful answer. I'm going to ask you a few questions about relating to the book Pentecostal Republic, but still sort of staying rather general sort of in our discussion about Nigerian politics before really delving in and talking about Pentecostal politics specifically. So in the book Pentecostal Republic, you documented the emergence of what I think could be called a full-fledged theocratic class of mostly Southern Christians in Nigeria. What role have theocratic elites, both Christian theocratic elites and Muslim theocratic elites, been playing in the current ongoing struggles over the country's future, and what role does religion in general play in these contests and conflicts?
So thank you. So I will start with the latter, which is about the role of religion and religious consciousness in politics. I think it goes without saying that people's understanding of politics, people's relationships with political agents, with members of the political class, people's understanding of the justice or injustice of how public goods are to be distributed, all those things are mediated by religion and religious calculations. So that's the general point. The specific point about the religious elite is, so the argument I advance in Pentecostal Republic is that when you think about the Fourth Republic, which is the Nigerian Fourth Republic, starting 1999 up till now, 2 fundamental things happened. So the first thing that happened was that the birth of the Fourth Republic was coincident with the emergence of Pentecostalism as a denominational force. So the argument is this. At this very same time as Nigeria was ushering in a fourth republic, learning the ropes again in terms of, the management of, a liberal democracy, Pentecostalism as an expression of Christianity was basically, as I said in the book, shouldering its way, to the front of the line. It was becoming this force that you could not ignore. But with a very, important distinction, that it wasn't just a religious force in terms of, badgering, having an impact on the religious space. It's also a cultural phenomenon, such that those two moments in Nigerian history converge, such that, as I claim in the book, or as I argue in the book, you can't make sense of the Fourth Republic without making sense of that other force that was coming out of the religious space, which is why, as I argue in the book, the Fourth Republic itself is more appropriately named or called, a Pentecostal Republic. So, and what's the most important, the most important symbol of that? The fact that in 1999, the man who became the first president of the Nigerian Fourth Republic, Olusegun Obasanjo, was a Pentecostal, right? And for many Pentecostals, it was an answer to their prayers, regarding what is called, a power shift from the northern part of the country to the southern part of the country. Shift in two senses, right? In a regional sense, but also in a religious sense. And that Obasanjo himself, after the, what I call the Muslim interregnum of Yaradua between 1997 and 2000, it was succeeded by Goodluck Jonathan, right? Another Pentecostal, right? And that even when you look at the man who is there now, the current president, Buhari, that he himself acknowledged at a particular point that in order to capture the ultimate office in the land, he had to make peace with the Pentecostals. So, the second time I think when he ran for office, or the third time when he ran for, because he did it 4 times before eventually succeeding, he chose a Pentecostal as his vice president, Tunde Bakari, of the Latter Rain Assembly. I think it's now called the Citadel Church. The name changed, but he lost at that time. But he did not, forget the lesson that you need a Pentecostal. So I think he probably surmised, as I argue in the book, that he had the wrong one. But I think this time around, I think he struck gold, with Yemi Osinbajo, his current vice president. So the point there is that, it's not that the religious elite, particularly the Pentecostal elite, continues to exercise, an outsized influence, not only on politics, not only on ordinarily secular matters, but also on the moral imagination, right? So one example, and maybe we'll get to this, think about the current Twitter ban, by President Buhari. The fact that the people leading from the front, the so-called revolutionaries, latter-day converts to human rights, and social justice, are Pentecostal pastors who are saying, hey, you can't ban us because we've got so number of branches, in different parts of, part of the world. And one of them, the General Overseer of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, actually quoted the United Nations, Human Rights Declaration. I said, look, I have a right to tweet. I don't know if there's a right to tweet, but, making an argument about free speech. So that tells you, I'm not giving too long an answer to your question.
Not at all. Please continue. Yeah.
Excuse me. But it speaks to, the visibility, the prominence, and the impact of the religious elite, in this case the Pentecostal elite, which in itself is an aspect of the way in which spirituality in general continues to impact politics, continues to impact the way people think about power, continues to impact the way people think about the economy, or the way people think about the future, in general.
That was a really rich answer, and it touches on about 5 other questions that I was planning to ask you. So let me try and go through those in a somewhat orderly fashion. You mentioned in the book, in Pentecostal Republic, about this phenomenon, or maybe one could call it sort of a political calculation, and you alluded to it just a moment ago too, about rotating the presidency among people from different regions, people from different religious backgrounds, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon? Because some of our listeners may not be familiar with the concept.
So it's a good question. It's what is called the rotational principle. It's not in the Nigerian constitution. It's basically a mutual. It's an entente among the political class, right? An understanding, that if the North enjoys power for 8 years, then the South ought to also enjoy power, and it seems to be honored, from time to time until it's not honored, and it's honored in the breach, if you know what I mean. So, for instance, when Yar'Adua succeeded, Obasanjo, right? Power was basically, so with Obasanjo, power had shifted, remember, from the North to the South, which was when, in 1999, when Obasanjo won the election, 2 Southern Christians contested for the presidency. So from the point of view of the South, the winner of the election was going to come from the South. And remember, what was going on was that the political elite had basically agreed to compensate the South for the loss, the death in prison of millionaire businessman MK Abiola. So the agreement was that, okay, right? So let's give power to the South. You can call it, moral or political reparations. We killed one of your sons. We're sorry. Here is the presidency, right? So Obasanjo became president, and the understanding was, okay, the power having shifted to the South will go back to the North, which it did, with Yar'Adua. But Yar'Adua then died in office. So that wasn't part of the calculation that Yar'Adua was going to die. He died before he completed his first term in office. The understanding being he will spend 2 terms of 4 years each, 8 terms. So when Goodluck Jonathan took over after a prolonged crisis because the northern elite, being politically savvy, realized that once you give somebody power, there is no telling what they're going to do with it. Right, but eventually, they had to play the constitutional game. So Goodluck Jonathan took over, and when he took over, the understanding was that he will complete the first term, whereas power will go back to the North, because you remember it was still the North slot, not the South. But of course, once you know how things are in politics, once you start, it's like, you can start a war, right? You then, you don't know how it's going to end. So Jonathan, was very skillful, and he completed that term. And then he also wanted to, extend and run, for office, but as you now know, he won, and then he lost in, 2015 to Buhari, by which time the understanding again was that power will go back, to the North. So Buhari is in the middle of his second term now. So all the jostling going around, centers on the understanding, or arises from the understanding that power will go back again to the South, right? So the basic understanding, the basic principle of the rotational principle is that, in a federal state, there should be give and take, right? That power should not be domiciled in one part of the country. And it's a very interesting point in Nigeria, because part of the frustration, from the southern political elite is that for a long time, especially when Nigeria, was under the military, that all the military rulers were northerners, right? So that, one of the ways in which to redress that historical injustice was to, give power back to the South. The problem is that the South has never meant, the Igbos in the East, right? Because the South is also not homogeneous. There are hundreds, of ethnic groups, in the southern part of the country as there are in the northern, in the northern part of the country. But the basic understanding is that in order to satisfy, both regions, North and South, you must make sure there's continuous rotation of power. So that's where the rotational principle comes from.
Thank you so much. I also want to talk about, you mentioned President Buhari's now sort of infamous Twitter ban in your previous response. I want to go back to that, but see if I can also tie in something from the response you just gave. So let's see how well I do that. And apologies in advance that it's a
No,
somewhat
that's
scattered question. In Pentecostal Republic, your book that we've been talking about a lot so far this interview and will continue to, you describe a situation in which there's sort of a fuzzy line in Nigeria, between advocating for religious freedom on the one hand, and actually agitating for the appropriation of state institutions for what we might call Pentecostal purposes, on the other hand. So I wonder if President Buhari's recent online comments against Southeastern Nigerians, which seemingly got international media attention primarily actually because Twitter took the action of removing the offending tweet. I wonder if and how that's changed the conversation around religious freedom in Nigeria, again, specifically vis-a-vis this mandate to kind of use the state for Pentecostal purposes. And more broadly, and perhaps more interestingly, I'd also be curious to hear how you'd answer the more general question of what has changed since Buhari made that statement, that many people rightly, I think, interpreted as a threat to use force, and maybe even lethal force against dissidents in the Southeast. And I know this is already a long question, but speaking of the Southeast, since you just mentioned that Igbos have generally felt excluded from this power sharing agreement, and the fact that of these kind of secessionist movements or independence movements popping up in Nigeria nowadays, the Igbo one, which includes the indigenous peoples of Biafra and other groups, seems to be one of the longer standing movements. So I know that's a terribly long question. I wonder if you could respond.
If I forget any part of it, maybe you remind me. So
I will,
let me quickly, so the first part of the question, the Buhari ban, on Twitter has no religious components, as far as I can tell. And many people, appropriately, see it that way. They don't see it in any religious terms. What many people, whether in the, opposition, People's Democratic, Party, or within civil society at large, what they see is a revival, of the old Buhari. Remember, he was military head of state, between 1983 and 1985, before he was ousted in a coup d'etat by Ibrahim Babangida, and there's the suspicion, deep down, that even though he has, as they say in Nigeria, traded khaki for agbada, that the soldier in him is still there. And part of what I think maybe your viewers may also need to understand about the ban is that, in a sense, it's been coming, right? So remember, there was there were these mass protests in Nigeria, around EndSARS, the movement to basically try and eliminate all law enforcement impunity against ordinary Nigerians last year. And one of the interesting things at that time, I think, that the sheer passion, the surge and the intensity of those protests, I think caught the government unawares. And for Buhari, I think that he was basically looking at those protests and thinking, oh my God, what are we looking at here? Especially the way in which, transnational actors, people like Jack Dorsey of Twitter, were able to bypass the state and donate money. I remember Jack Dorsey tweeting on, asking people to donate on Twitter, to use Bitcoin, basically support Nigerian civil society while undermining the Nigerian state, right? So that's the reading from within the state. And for Buhari, it was always on his mind to do something about it. So this was, the move by Jack Dorsey, basically, banning Buhari for 12 hours. Remember, it wasn't going to be a permanent ban. It was going to be a 12-hour ban. And I think Jack Dorsey was saying, look, how dare you, say something, threaten violence, against your own people. We may have a conversation about, whether that's a good thing, to ban, to remove the statement, or to not remove the statement. But, I think it's interesting that was the moment that Buhari then felt, okay, I've been thinking long about what I'm going to do about this thing. Here is the opportunity, for me, to do that. So I think that's the general background to that. There is no religious component to it. But you're absolutely right. And I think this is the second part of your question, if I remember correctly, about Igbo's feeling of being excluded from, the political mainstream in Nigeria. And I think that's true. Remember, I told you earlier about moral political reparations, right? The fact that when Obasanjo won in 1999, to become the first president of the Fourth Republic, there was an understanding predicated, it was predicated on the understanding that we are paying back, right? There's a flip side to that. There's the other side of the coin, which is that Igbos feel, and not, illegitimately, that they are being punished for what they did during the Civil War, right? 1967 to 1970, which is, how dare you want to break away? So with the Yorubas, it was, we killed one of your, most famous sons, we're sorry, here is the presidency. And then with the Igbos, it's like, how dare you want to, exit, this arrangement? How dare you want to do this? We cannot trust you, So, and Igbos rightly, I think, feel that for the most part, they are still, because since then, there hasn't been a single Igbo, a single member of, from the Igbo ethnic group that has become, risen to the nation's top office. So that's driving that. But the important thing is that it's not only the Igbos who are sitting with disaffection. So if you are following, events in Nigeria on a daily basis, you can see that there's ethno-national resurgence in different parts of, of the country. The IPOB, representing the Igbos, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta in the Niger Delta region. There's the Odua People's Congress, in the western part of the country. There are all kinds of ethno-regional entities like that, and whether or not you think, the claims that they are pressing are legitimate, the fact that everybody sort of feels a sense of disaffection with the state, I think is the more, is the thing to keep in mind. The third part of your question, I think, has to do with, is it Twitter itself? I'm blocking on the final part of your question now.
Yeah, it was basically whether or not Buhari's sort of comments changed the conversation around religious freedom, but I think you already sort of addressed it.
Yeah. But it has changed something though. It has reminded people that you have to be on guard, even against a notionally democratic state, right? So for many people, the fact that, so many Nigerians will boast to you that, well, we may not have electricity, we may not have infrastructure, but at least we have this generally, with this vague democratic framework. The perception of threat from within that framework is one of the things that I think this has changed. And the fact that right now there's a lively conversation going on about the limits, the extent of state privileges. What is it that the Nigerian Senate or the House of Representatives, can do? How does this affect the political elite? The religious dimension, I think, it actually has a religious dimension, right? Which is that, as I said, the people, the overnight social justice revolutionaries, are, the members of the Theocratic elite. But what I find interesting is this. I don't think they are necessarily doing what they're doing, which is champion people's right to tweet. I don't think they are necessarily doing it for reasons of classical liberalism. They didn't just wake up and find, and discover their inner John Locke. That's not what has happened. You know what has happened? What has happened is that these churches are transnational entities. The leaders have deep pockets. The congregations are scattered all around the world. And for once, they feel that that empire is under threat. Remember what happens if you have a business on Twitter, because people use, all those things for all kinds of things, for preaching, for business and all of that. And all of a sudden, you cannot tweet. It means you can't reach your members. Your members cannot reach you, right? Which is a very interesting way in which the theological and the political can mix, and the mix can turn ordinarily conservative religious agents into political revolutionaries, at least for the moment. But the other part is, I'm sure that when these guys are thinking about this, they don't necessarily just see a threat to Twitter. They see a threat to Facebook. They see a threat to their media empires. And they start asking themselves, if he can take this away, what next is he going to take away? right? So you could almost thank Buhari for doing this, because if only for the fact that he has made people realize how fragile some of the gains that the country has made since 1999, how fragile those gains are.
That's a really fascinating answer. Thank you so much. You touched on the EndSARS movement, which I was also hoping to ask you about.
Okay.
So I'll just briefly pose a question to you on that topic. Would you mind just giving a very broad appraisal of that movement? Because I think that some of our listeners probably heard about it. Some of them may not know all of what it's about. And please also feel free to touch on everything from protest strategies, which I know in the past you've written about, to the relative successes and failures of achieving the movement's goals, and to the current status of protests in the country, given that I think it's fair to say the country is now in a much more agitated state than when EndSARS initially broke out. Yeah.
So that's a great question. So let's start with what we are ending, right? SARS. SARS is Special Anti-Robbery Squad, right? Believe it or not, SARS has been around for a while. So when I've written a piece about this for Current History, it was actually established in the twilight of the Babangida regime. And the justification at that time was that there was this, sudden, upsurge of armed robbery attacks across the country. And the agreement among the political elite was that, conventional, policing was not sufficient to undo, to deal with the problem. So what do? You create this, extra unit outside of, and then you resource it appropriately, which is what happened. But of course, Special Anti-Robbery Squad not only went up against armed robbers. SARS, as things tend to turn out in Nigeria, they eventually turned their guns on ordinary citizens. So people protested. No, so the EndSARS that took place last year was about the fourth or fifth time that people were protesting, against the impunity of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. But here is also what's also important, that each of those protests had led to the apparent elimination of the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. But as I noted in my Current History article, part of what's interesting about Nigerian politics is this: the way in which organizations that have been, for all intent and purposes, proscribed, the way they resurrect, I think it's also very interesting. So SARS gets buried, but it also keeps coming back. And I think that was the frustration that built up, in October, 2020, and that led to that, very mighty eruption. People basically saying, look, we've been trying to get rid of this thing. It's not going away. We want it to go away, finally. But remember, something happened in 2020 that also contributed to the magnitude and the ferocity, of EndSARS. For the first time in, probably since Nigeria became independent, the Nigerian elite and the people of Nigeria were trapped in the same space. What do I mean? Because of COVID, you couldn't travel, right? So each time you had a problem in Nigeria, if you have enough money in your pocket, what do? Take the next flight to London, lie low for 6 weeks, let out steam, and come back. So migration, temporary migration, in case for the members of the elite, and migration out of the country for members of the professional class and the intelligentsia like myself, has always been a way for people, to deal with the problems of the country, right? Remember the classic, exit, voice, and loyalty. Like, if you can't stay, if you can't be loyal to then you get out. People do that. But for the first, in 2020, remember, nobody could travel. You couldn't go in, you couldn't go out. So I think that led to a lot of pent-up feeling and a lot of, frustration. And then finally, the fact that in 2020, again on account of COVID, oil prices worldwide bottomed out, right? It was basically, I remember right around, I don't know if it was May, June, here in the United States, when the price of oil fell below zero. It was minus, right? If you wanted oil to drink, you could get it for free. Such was the situation, meaning that for an oil-reliant economy like Nigeria, it's a disaster. So it was the coming together of all these, social, historical, economic, and cultural factors that led to, that upsurge of, violence on the streets that you saw with EndSARS. So that's one part of it. The other part of it, which I like to stress, and which I think is important for our understanding of Nigerian politics, is that it's important that when you think about violence, what I call the economy of violence, that you don't limit it to extra, conventional, organizations like, special anti-robbery squad created by the state and all of that. That it's important to focus on what I call, everyday incivility, and that's what law enforcement itself has to be seen as a part of. The fact that the ordinary individual lives in permanent expectation of bodily violation, right? Either from, so think about the economy of violence in this way. Violence between individuals, including domestic violence that men visit regularly on women. Violence between members of law enforcement, police on police. Violence between the police and soldiers, which is par for course, in Nigeria. Armed robbery, religious violence, as you see with Boko Haram, such that violence involving law enforcement is only an aspect of that broader economy of violence. And it's important that SARS is not isolated, that it be seen as part of this general concourse, and that's how, so, which is why if you look at, I don't know if you've taken a look at some of the, many of the placards that people were holding up, they were all over the place. It wasn't just end SARS, it was end police brutality, end armed robbery, end impunity, give us jobs. So there's a sense in which when you protest about one thing in Nigeria, because of the way things are in the country, you are almost always protesting about other things as well. So even though you may start out by saying, "Oh, I want to protest," the fact that somebody did X on so date, other things gradually, there's an accretion, other things gradually attach to those things, because rightly or wrongly, people then say, "Oh, what about this? What about that?" And this will be my final point, that as an example of that. So if you look at, EndSARS, you also saw people, there were placards of, people saying, trans lives matter, right? Nigerian gay lives matter, right? Then you think, what has that got to do with ending, law enforcement impunity? Until you reach out, which as I did, and then the people tell you stories about being molested and being violated on account of their sexuality. So you find, so the broader thing to understand there is that economy of violence, of which, the EndSARS movement, or that the brutality of SARS or the brutality of police is just a mere aspect.
That's a really great observation. And I think the same really generally tends to hold true in the US as well, and probably a lot of other places, where when one issue is brought to the fore,
exactly,
you start to see all the other
issues
that are related
come out of the woods. Yeah,
exactly, because none of these things tend to exist in a vacuum. I'll ask you one more question on the subject of violence, since we were just talking about that, and then I really do want to delve into talking about Pentecostal politics.
Okay.
In Pentecostal republics, you wrote that subalterns may use violence, this is a quote, for the purpose of recuperation, or of self-recuperation and assertion. How far would this analysis get us in trying to understand the seemingly daily violence that we've been seeing recently coming out of news reports about Nigeria, which in some, but maybe not all cases, appears to be tied to political motives? And if the idea of violence as a form of self-assertion doesn't account for some of the violence that we're seeing, then what do you think might?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. The way to understand is to see violence in the spectrum, right? So let's think about Boko Haram, for instance, right? There's a religious, there's clearly a religious element, to the violence of Boko Haram, but there's also a political dimension to it. The problem with Boko Haram is both are so entangled, so implicated that you can't draw a line, say this is where violence for religious reasons starts, and this is where violence for political reasons starts. So if you think about a student demonstration, for instance. So somebody says, we've not had electricity in our hostel for the last 3 months. We're going to protest. So that's legitimate political grievance. And then in the course of doing that, they target a police station, right? You ask, the first thing that occurs to you is, those protesters protesting the absence of electricity in a student hostel have just set a police station on fire, right? The police station could not have supplied electricity, right? Why would they attack a police station? The thing is to then so there's always symbolism, to violence, and that's like part of the underlying grievance is not just electricity, right? So when people then go to the to the police station, partly what they're saying is, we're frustrated and would rather lash out at anything that seems to represent the state, and we don't care where. So over the last 3 months, for instance, several offices belonging to the Independent National Electoral Commission have been targeted, right? Police stations have been burned down in different parts of the country, right? So one of the things that happened with EndSARS was attack on members of the police, right? So I think the signal that is being sent out there is, look, we're going to use violence, and we're going to use our violence to target, state entities, state, infrastructure, representatives of the state, so that people can know that, our grievance is genuine, and then they can listen to us. The tricky thing there, and which is why I say, it's important to see this in the spectrum, is there is always a tipping point where legitimate political violence tips over into out and out criminality, right? And the line itself, can be, very difficult, to draw. But that's one part of the answer to your question, which I think is very interesting. Here is the second part, which is much more disturbing, which is sometimes when you see violence, you also have to ask yourself in a Nigerian context, and this applies, to many African countries as well, whose violence, right? So during the Sierra Leonean Civil War, if you read some of the literature, there was this phenomenon called sobels, soldiers by day, rebels by night, right? People who work for the state with the uniform of the state by day, and people who oppose and are trying, for all intents and purposes, to remove the state at night. But the same individual exchanging agency literally overnight. And the reason why that comes to mind for me is part of what we are seeing in Nigeria, some of what my own ongoing research shows. So if you look at abductions, for instance, there's a political element to it. So when abducting people started, when the abduction economy started in Nigeria, it started in the southeastern part of the country, where members of the movement for emancipation of the Niger Delta, were basically kidnapping expatriates. People who worked for Shell, people who worked for Chevron, in order to get money. It was basically to punish those transnational corporations. And it fitted within a particular moral economy. People, even though people didn't justify it, they understood it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, okay, those guys have been the ones, pillaging the resources, causing all the, devastation in the community. Well, the people have a right to fight back. And then, the abduction economy itself expanded. So right now, you're not sure who is who and who is doing what. And here is the example. And this has been reported, across the media in Nigeria. So one of the reasons why people fall, prey to, abduction gangs is, so a soldier, so you see a group of soldiers on the highway, flags you down. you are an obedient citizen, right? You are a citizen of, you want to, you don't want to, you want to, follow the law, obey the law. And then you stop, only to discover that the uniform was right, but it was being worn by kidnappers, right? How do they get the uniform? Now, part of what you've also discovered is that members of the armed forces rent out their soldier, their uniform for a fee.
Wow.
Right? So
wow.
The abductor takes the uniform. So there are 5 of us soldiers. We rent out 5 uniforms, right? Somebody says, I'm going to make, I don't know, $50,000 with these uniforms. You give me, a 20% cut. You return my uniform, you get your money, the people who have been abducted are released, everybody wins. Well, nobody wins, if you know what I'm talking about. But so that's what makes the current economy of violence so muddled, and so sociologically interesting, because you're then trying to separate agency, distill agency, and try to understand where classic abduction stops, where strategic abduction, begins, and where you also fit in the fact that there are people who have seen this economy and they are basically leveraging it, cynically, of course, for resources.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mind-blowing subject to think on.
There's a lot going on in there.
Yeah. Like you said, I mean, what is the site of agency? What is the
exactly?
What is the bottom line of a person's
victim,
agency?
Who is the perpetrator, and all those things? Those things can change, very quickly. Where is the state, right? I've heard. I mean, this is unconfirmed, but I've heard, from, and because I also have friends, that I speak to, that I can get intelligence from, who have told me that, sometimes state officials, also, arrange abductions, where, an armed gang goes to a particular location, rounds off 100 kids, and then negotiate with the state, right? And then the state, of course, is forced to pay up, right? And then behind, the money is divided, the kids are released, the state pays out, and everything is hunky-dory.
And you're saying that some political figure would end up getting a cut of...
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
It's interesting. A friend of mine who is sort of an academic, I guess, and he's researching, concepts related to security in West Africa and stuff like that. Was making a point that probably the worst security strategy he's ever heard of has to be the current strategy in some parts of the North, whereby they essentially say, the state is taking a conciliatory stance towards reformed bandits, meaning if you've gone and rounded up children or even maybe committed massacres or whatever, as long as you come out and indicate that you've reformed yourself, the state is interested in just moving forward in the spirit of...
At the very least, that should make you skeptical.
Very interesting.